The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trail that wound through the red rock country of Arizona. It was the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and dance, turning the distant mesas into wavering mirages along this desolate stretch of land where few travelers ventured and few were still lingered. A terrible sight waited beneath the gnarled branches of an ancient mesquite tree. Asterisk. 26-year-old Grace Holloway lay motionless in the shade, her long brown hair matted with dust and dried blood. Her simple blue dress, once modest and clean, was now torn and stained from the ordeal she'd endured. Around her neck hung a crude wooden sign with words burned into it that spoke of humanity's capacity for cruelty. Useless mouth. Asterisk. Grace had been traveling west with a wagon train of settlers when fever struck the group. As people began to fall ill, fear overtook compassion. When Grace became too weak to keep up too sick to contribute to the daily chores, the wagon master made a decision that would haunt the decent folks in the group for years to come. They left her behind with just enough water for a day, and that horrible sign as a final insult asterisk that had been 3 days ago. Asterisk. Now Grace drifted in and out of consciousness, her lips cracked and her skin burning from the relentless sun. Fever dreams. She heard her grandmother's voice telling her stories of angels who walked among ordinary people, performing quiet miracles when all hope seemed lost. Asterisk. The sound of hoofbeats on the hard-packed earth barely registered in her fading awareness. Asterisk. Caleb Mitchell was a man of few words, but his eyes missed nothing. At 34, he had the weathered look of someone who'd spent his life under the open sky. His face tanned and lined from years of honest work. His brown cowboy hat was pulled low against the afternoon glare, and his brown vest and shirt showed the practical wear of a working rancher. He rode with the easy confidence of a man who belonged in this harsh but beautiful country. Asteris Caleb owned a small ranch about 10 miles from where the trail bent toward the mountains. Wasn't much by some standards. A modest adobe house, a barn corral for his horses, and enough grazing land for a small herd of cattle. But it was his earned through years of saving every penny and working from dawn to dusk. Asterisk. He was returning from town with supplies when he spotted something unusual beneath the mesquite tree. Caleb had learned long ago that in the desert, anything out of place deserved investigation. It might be a lost traveler, an injured animal, or sometimes, unfortunately, something worse. Asterisk. As he drew closer, heart clenched at what he saw. A young woman lay crumpled in the shade, clearly near death, but it was the sign around her neck that made his jaw tighten with anger. Caleb had seen humanity's cruelty before, but this kind of heartless abandonment struck him like a physical blow. Asterisk. He dismounted quickly, his boots making soft sounds in the sand as he knelt beside Grace. Her breathing was shallow, her skin hot with fever, but she was alive. That was what mattered most. "Miss," he said softly, his voice roughened by years of speaking mainly to horses and cattle. "Miss, can you hear me?" Asterisk. Grace's eyelids fluttered, and for a moment her gaze focused on his face. Through her fever-hazed vision, she saw kind eyes beneath the brim of his hat, and something in his expression told her that her ordeal might finally be over. Asterisk. "Am I dreaming?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Asterisk. "No, ma'am," Caleb replied gently. "You're going to be all right now." Asterisk. Without another word. He carefully lifted the cruel sign from around her neck and tossed it aside. Then, with movements that were surprisingly tender for such a rugged man, he gathered Grace into his arms and lifted her as easily as if she were a child. Asterisk. His horse, a steady baymar named Sage, stood patiently as Caleb mounted with Grace cradled against his chest. The ride back to his ranch was slow and careful, with Caleb stopping frequently to give Grace small sips of water from his canteen. The ranch house was simple but clean, with thick adobe walls that kept the interior cool even on the hottest days. Caleb carried Grace to the spare bedroom, a small but comfortable space with a window that looked out over the desert toward the distant mountains. risk for the next week. Caleb tended to Grace with the same quiet dedication he brought to caring for his animals. He had learned basic medical skills from necessity living. Alone on a ranch miles from the nearest doctor required a man to be self-sufficient. He made broth from beef and vegetables, coaxed her to drink water and herbal teas, and sat by her bedside during the worst of her fever. Caleb was not a man given to long conversations, but he had a gift for creating calm. His presence was steady and reassuring, like a rock in a storm. When Grace was delirious with fever, his quiet voice reading from an old book of poetry seemed to anchor her to the world of the living asterisk. As Grace slowly recovered, she began to notice the small kindnesses that revealed Caleb's character. Fresh, wild flowers appeared in a mason jar beside her bed each morning. Her torn dress was mended and cleaned while she slept. When she was strong enough to sit up, she found that he'd carved her a small wooden cross to replace the terrible sign. Something beautiful to remind her of hope instead of despair. Why, Grace asked one evening as Caleb brought her a bowl of soup. It was the first full sentence she'd managed in days. Her voice was still weak but clear. Caleb paused in the doorway, his hat in his hands. For a long moment he didn't speak, and Grace wondered if he'd heard her question. My pa used to say he finally replied, his voice soft but steady, that we're all just walking each other home. Some folks lose their way, and some folks need a hand to keep going. Seemed to me you needed a hand. Grace felt tears prick her eyes at the simple wisdom in his words. In her previous life, she'd been surrounded by people who measured worth in terms of what someone could provide, how hard they could work, how much they could contribute, how useful they could be. But Caleb had seen her at her most vulnerable, wearing a sign that declared her worthless, and he'd simply seen a human being who needed help. As the days passed, and Grace grew stronger, she began to help around the house in small ways. She mended his shirts, cooked simple meals, and tended a small herb garden behind the house. But Caleb never made her feel as though she owed him anything for saving her life. Her contributions were accepted with the same quiet grace he showed. In everything else, I keep thinking about that sign, Grace said. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson, how those people could just decide I was worthless, Caleb was quiet for a long moment, whittling a piece of wood with his pocket knife. My mother used to say that every person carries a light inside them, he said finally. Some folks are so busy looking at the ground they never see it. But that doesn't mean the light isn't there. He looked up at Grace, and in his eyes she saw not pity, recognition, as if he saw something in her that she'd forgotten was there herself. You're not useless, he continued, his voice carrying quiet conviction. You're not a burden. You're a person with dignity and worth, and anyone who can't see that is the one who's truly blind. Grace felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the desert heat. For the first time since her ordeal began, she felt like herself again. Not a victim, not a burden, but a woman capable of hope and dreams. As autumn came to the desert, bringing cooler nights and the distant promise of winter, Grace and Caleb had settled into a comfortable routine. They worked side by side during the day, sharing the chores and the quiet satisfaction of maintaining their small corner of the world. In the evenings, they sat on the porch or by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes simply enjoying the peaceful silence. Neither of them spoke of the future, but both understood that something precious was growing between them. It wasn't built on grand gestures or passionate declarations, but on something deeper, mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of steady affection that could weather any storm. One morning, as Grace fed the chickens in the yard behind the house, she heard the sound of approaching horses. Her heart jumped with old fear, but Caleb's reassuring presence beside her reminded her that she was safe now. A small group of travelers had stopped to water their horses at the well. As Caleb spoke with them, Grace heard fragments of their conversation talk of a town growing up around the new railroad, opportunities for people willing to work hard and build something lasting. You thinking of moving on? Caleb asked that evening, his tone carefully neutral. Asterisk Grace looked at him, this quiet man who'd saved her life and shown her what real kindness looked like. Are you asking me to stay? Asterisk Caleb set down his coffee cup and met her eyes. I'm asking. If you want to stay, there's a difference. Asterisk Grace smiled, understanding, flowing between them like a warm current. I want to stay, Caleb. I want to build something here with you. Asterisk. He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Then we'll build it together. Asterisk. As the first